I got a couple of places that I can begin today's class. And so what I want to know from y'all is where you would like to begin today's class. So here's the options. We can talk about statistics, or we can talk about just logical conclusions. Like, here's some ideas about when life does or doesn't begin. And here's the logical conclusions you come to if you take those ideas. So where would y'all rather begin? Lines of logic or statistics?
I vote lines of logic.
There's one. Anybody want to vote against her? It's okay.
That's okay. My feelings won't be hurt.
Yeah, I figured you'd be okay with it. Nobody? We're just going to do lines of logic? All right, so we're going to do lines of logic. Let's start here with, give me some ideas when life could begin.
When you draw your first breath.
Okay, first breath. Here, I'm actually going to give y'all 6 potential places that life could begin. And breath is going to number 6. Okay, give me another example.
Heartbeat.
Heartbeat.
Oh, I have
Okay.
a question already.
Already?
Yes.
I didn't get started yet. All right, what do you got?
Aren't breath and birth different?
How so?
I thought it's been proven that babies can breathe in the womb. Not oxygen per se, but
So I'm taking
they
breath
are
to mean
breathing.
respiratory.
Okay.
And the reason is that a lot of people point to Genesis where God breathed into Adam's nostrils and say that was his first breath, but we talked about the difference between breath and breath of life last week. Y'all remember that? We had those words on the board.
Mm-hmm.
So we've already kind of debunked that point from a scriptural standpoint, but we're also going to talk about it from a logical standpoint. So I'm going to take respiratory system breath as opposed to the concept of the baby needing oxygen in the womb. Is that okay? Okay, cool. All right. I have breath and heartbeat. Along with heartbeat, I'm going to put blood here as well. There's a reason for it, but I'll come back to it. Other ideas?
Brain activity?
Brain activity. That's another one. Good job. Give me another one.
Conception.
Conception. Okay. What else?
Ability to survive outside the womb.
Ooh,
Viability.
that's so sweet.
Okay. The other one you guys probably won't come up with, and that's okay. It's called gastrulation. And that's the point at which you can't have twins. Okay? After roughly 2 weeks in the womb, you know whether you got a 1 or a 2 or a 3, okay? Because after that point, they don't split, okay? So I'm going to put in parentheses here, split point. Okay? Those are 6 options commonly used. And I put them in this order for a reason. I didn't just randomly assign them. What's the reason for the order?
That's the order they happen in.
Thank you. That's the order in which they occur. All right, so let's start with fertilization or conception. When does that occur? Okay, I'll help you out. Day 1, okay? And I told you I'll have a hard time with this one. So, gastrulation occurs at roughly 2 weeks. Heartbeat. When is that?
I thought
A little shorter.
18 days? Right.
5 to 6 weeks, roughly. Now, how many weeks are in a month, just so we're all on the same page?
4.
4 or 5, depending on how the month goes, right? But generally, 4.5 weeks, right? Longest month, 31 days. Shortest was 28. You're going to get at least 4 weeks in there. Some will have 4 and 3 more days. So 4.5, okay? We're talking just over a month after conception is the first heartbeat, okay? Brain activity.
Couple months?
A little longer. Okay, now 24 to 27. How many months are we talking here?
6.
6-ish. okay, on the low end for brain activity. Viability.
Like 8 months.
A little shorter. I'm going to help you out with this one, okay? 24 weeks is the assumed point of viability, okay? I got some stats to go with that one, okay? At 24 weeks, there's a 60 to 70% survival rate for kids delivered.
Cool.
2 out of 3, okay? If you go to 28 weeks, that number goes 80 to 90%, and after 32 weeks, it's basically the same as them being carried to term. How long is term? 9 months, 39 to 40 weeks, okay? Right in there. So, the odds are essentially equivalent from week 32 on the survivability of that child. And there's a 2/3 chance at 24, which is why that's considered the viability point. Now, one thing that we'll get into a little bit later, because I'm going to use my child as an illustration for this, because I have a preemie child. You were a preemie child. Very similar scenario. But one of the things they had in the NICU where my daughter stayed for the first month of her life was they had little signs on the wall that said, this child was born at so many weeks and this is them now. And there was one little girl on that wall that had been born at 19 weeks. Okay? 6 weeks prior to what is the commonly assumed viability point, but they have a picture of that child on the wall at 4 years old. Okay? So, when I say the viability point, there's some flex there depending on where they're born, the access to healthcare they have, and we're going to talk some about that from a logical conclusion standpoint. Okay? So, and then birth or breath, what are we talking about here?
That's just after birth.
That's your 9-month point, right? 9 months / 39 to 40 weeks. Okay? That should be a parentheses, not a 1. In case anybody thinks I wrote 19 months. All right, so there's our 6 points. Now, let's talk about the issues that we have with these things. All right? Fertilization, why would that be the point at which that life begins?
Because it's the point at which something new is created.
Okay? New or unique. Unique DNA is created at conception, at fertilization. Everything about that child from eye color, hair color, height, potential to be bald, all that stuff programmed in their DNA at conception, all right? Like the likelihood, everything that my son or daughter is now was there at conception. And many of the things that we won't even find out in the course of time until way later in their lives was there at conception. It is new and unique. That child was not me or my wife. It was some of both, but totally unique and individualistic. Okay? Gastrulation is also interesting. I want to put in here just real quick. Okay, the reason that this is important is a lot of people want to debate that, well, if you have a single embryo and it splits into 2, did the single embryo have 2 souls and now they split into their own, or when does the soul occur? And my argument to that point would be, why would there be 2 souls in one being? Okay? That would be odd, right? Like we can agree that would be a weird argument to make. And so when did the second being come into existence?
Whenever they split.
When they split, right? So why would I say that, again, this is the same discussion we had last week about, well, God can know the intent of something, but for us, for our determination, until something comes into existence, it has not begun. That second child begins at the split, not prior. Okay, we okay with that point? Make sense? Okay. So I wanted to at least bring up this point because this is a common one that I saw come up when I was reading through the points people make for a viability point or a point at which life begins. Okay? So, gastrulation. Just another thing I wanted to throw out there for you guys to be aware of. It's a technical point. The likelihood that you hear it at any point in your life, very, very low. Okay? I had to go learn the word. When I saw it in a list of points at which life could begin, I had no clue what it meant. So, I'm not a biologist, so there you go. The third one, heartbeat, blood. Why is this important?
Because blood is tied very closely to life.
Okay, so blood is tied closely to life. So people look at things like Genesis 9 or Leviticus 17. So it'd be Genesis 9:4. Leviticus 17:11. People can look at that and say, see, life is in the blood, heartbeat associated with blood, which, by the way, this version of heartbeat is the electrical pattern that will become a heartbeat, not the lub-dub that your heart does now. Okay? This is a different kind of heartbeat. But it's a thing that we point to because it's something that every person, regardless of their association with this discussion, says, if it has a heartbeat, it's probably alive, right? Most people kind of want to get behind that point. This is a point of commonality, both inside and outside of the religious world. So that's one of the reasons that the heartbeat thing is such a big deal. But the earliest stages of the electrical pattern that becomes a heartbeat is 5 to 6 weeks. But most of the time when you hear something about a heartbeat, they're talking 8 to 12. But this is the earliest point it can be detected. Okay? So, some of this has to do with a misunderstanding in the religious community of the life being in the blood, and we'll talk about the logical failings of that point in just a second. All right? Brain activity. Why would we place so much value on brain activity?
Because we consider somebody to be not alive anymore if their brain is intact.
It has more to do with what we tie to death, right? So it's much more a tie to when someone is brain dead than it is when they're brain alive, okay? And we'll talk about the logical shortcomings of tying it to brain activity in just a minute. Lane, I'm going to make a very strong case for you can still be aborted at this point in life. But we're going to make, I'm telling you,
Watch out.
if you carry out this logic, I can get you to abortion in the 26th year if you're not careful with the brain activity argument. But this is important to understand because of the context of brain dead, higher brain function being necessary, which is usually the pushback. Well, the brain activity that you see at 24 to 27 weeks isn't real full brain activity. And I'm like, you might want to check the development pattern of the brain before you make that debate point. All right?
Because of like CPR, when they do CPR, you're brain dead and they're just pumping blood through your brain so it can turn back on if it needs to or if it can't.
Well, and also your brain has sections. Some things run on their own and some things don't. There's parts of your brain that can be alive without the higher brain functions not being alive. There's some difference there as well. But also it has to do with how long it takes your brain to develop post-birth as well. Okay? My daughter's brain is not fully developed. Not even close. But she has brain activity. It's obvious. Listen to her chatter. Okay? So, brain activity. It's used because of the understanding of what something being dead not having brain activity. All right? Viability. Why is that one important?
Well, it has to be a
Because
separate
people have
organism.
basis.
Okay. Separate. Megan, what was yours?
Well, it's not really.
No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it just gives people the ability to say that they want to abort if it's not viable.
Okay, so it's not a viable entity, it's not separate, it's not independent. This has a lot to do with something being dependent or independent. Okay? That's where viability usually comes into play. And then the last one, birth. It's kind of hard to argue when it's laying there, alive, screaming, breathing, heart beating, the whole thing. When you have the whole package, the debate kind of falls apart, right? Like, this one seems to be the point of undeniable. Okay? Now, let's talk about the shortcomings with these. And we'll go bottom up this time. If it is not alive until birth or its first respiratory through the nostrils and mouth breath, what's the problem with that? Let's say I've got somebody who is 8.5 months pregnant, but they haven't given birth yet. 10 seconds before that child is born, is it alive? Not by this definition. But if it were born, if she went into labor, we can all agree it's going to be alive, right? Like, if it's a natural, everything's fine with the fetus, I'll use that word. I prefer the word child because fetus is just Latin for child. But anyway, when it's born, we can all agree it's alive, right? But what was different about it 10 seconds prior?
It was not physically like seeable.
We couldn't see it. That's really it. We just couldn't see it, right? But if I hid it in a box, we still agree it's alive, right? Like, if it's around the corner in the next room, still alive, right? All right, so the idea of, well, until we can see it here, it's not really alive, that is denying some very obvious facts, right? Like, with the advantage of ultrasound, we can see that it's alive. Not just 10 seconds before it's born, but for a lot of weeks before it's born, right? I mean, you get your first ultrasound way, way, way back up here. The issue with this right here is that it says that there's something magical about the birth canal conferring life or value onto that child. That as long as it's in the womb, it's not alive, and when it's out of the womb, it is. But you've got to tell me what the magical switch that gets flipped is. Because, again, when we get to the viability point here in just a second, we're going to prove very little to do with whether or not that child is alive. Okay? So, the biggest thing that you need to point to, if anybody says that life begins at the first breath, and they mean respiratory breath or at birth, is I want to know what happens when I subtract 10 seconds. Why is it not alive? The other thing is if you want to define your terms, there's really only 3 categories that things can fall in. Things are alive, dead, or inanimate. That means something that's dead. Do we understand what that means? Not alive anymore, right? Inanimate, what is that?
Abiotic, never living.
Never living. Can't be, never was. All right? Which one does a baby fall into? Well, it's not inanimate because it's not that it never was, never will be, right? So we can X that one off. It's not prior alive and now is dead, so we can X that off. That leaves one category, right? Okay, this framework will help you a lot when you get to this question right here. Okay, it's alive when it's born. 10 seconds prior, which one was it? Because I've got you to admit it was alive here when I go plus 10 seconds. Yep, alive. All right, subtract 10 seconds. Now which one is it? Okay, they're going to have a really hard time, right? Back up to viability. Let's take this point right here and subtract 15, 16 weeks. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't the magic switch, at least as far as the argument goes, isn't it breath?
Okay,
Not
so
having to do with the birth.
okay, that's fine. So let's say if it were breath, okay, then here's my question, okay? And again, when we come back to this point, it's going to make this one make more sense. And there's a reason I'm doing it backwards. But if we delivered a child at 30 weeks, okay, it comes ahead of schedule, okay, which my child did, okay? She comes out breathing, right? But she didn't come out when she was supposed to. She's very early. 8, 9 weeks, as a matter of fact. Is she alive even though she's there ahead of schedule?
Yeah, she's breathing.
Yes, but if she had stayed there from week 30 to week 39, was she not alive during that 9 weeks?
She wouldn't have been until she...
By this definition. So here's the question with this definition, that breath confers life, is that, okay, so if I prevent it from breathing, I have not killed it, if breath is what gives it life. So if I kill it just prior to its first breath, and I use kill specifically for this reason, I have not killed it because it never breathed. But we can both agree that if I had not intervened, it was alive. Right? The shortcoming of this definition is to say that, okay, if breath is the first life, the first point of life, my preventing it from breathing is not killing it. It's not ending life. Which is where you get into the context of partial birth abortion, which is basically they induce labor and kill the child just before it comes out because it's not alive until it's born, which is legal in this country. Okay? So, 30, 32, 34, 36 weeks, as long as it doesn't breathe, it was never alive. Okay? Now, here's the other logical issue with this. If breath is what is required for life, all right, and conveniently or inconveniently, however you want to take it, we just went through a pandemic that was a respiratory illness, right? Mm-hmm. What did we do with a lot of people that got COVID? They couldn't breathe.
Put them
on a ventilator. What does a ventilator do? It breathes for you. It actually forces air into your lungs. Okay? Were those people dead?
No.
Could they breathe?
No.
Bingo. So they've already breathed, so we agree they're alive, but now they can't breathe on their own. We're actually having a machine do it for them, and nobody was arguing those people were already dead. Mm-hmm. Now, here's another thing. Pretty interesting, right? I told you at 24 weeks, and again, the viability point helps the birth point. At 24 weeks, there is a 60 to 70% chance that a child delivered will survive. You know what the odds of surviving being put on a ventilator are?
No.
1 in 10. 10%. You are 1/6 as likely to survive being put on a ventilator as you are being delivered at 24 weeks. But nobody's arguing the guy with the 10% chance is dead. And half of us are arguing that the child with the 60% likelihood of surviving is not alive. Do you see the conclusion here? Do you see how these points don't line up?
Thank you, that makes more sense.
Okay, I told you I'd get there. I just gotta get all my points in.
Sorry.
I'm building a building. I cannot put the walls up before the foundation, right? So, biggest killer on this, ventilators. Okay? I can point to an actual living person on a ventilator who only has a 10% chance of surviving that. And nobody wants to argue that they're dead, even though they're unable to draw breath. We can all agree that if we took them off the ventilator, the overwhelming majority of them that required it in the first place will die. And even after they've been on the ventilator, the overwhelming majority of them will still die. But nobody argues that that person's dead, right? That's the problem with saying breath is the point of life, or that breath is what it takes to constitute life. Does that make sense? Okay, back up to viability. Now, this is again where I'm going to use personal, this is anecdotal information, but it does carry out in a broader form of data. Viability is 24 weeks. That's in the U.S. Okay? What do we have in the U.S. that a lot of places in the world don't have?
Pretty good healthcare.
Pretty good healthcare, okay? Well, regardless of what you feel about the insurance world or the quality of healthcare or whatever else, we have a pretty good healthcare system here. That's why viability is at 24 weeks, which, by the way, remember, the conclusion was 39 to 40. We're a long way at 24, right? Everybody understands the distance between 24 and 40 is quite a bit. Okay, we all understand that? Viability is 24 weeks, but that's not consistent across the entire country. Y'all may not know this, but if you're born prior to 32 weeks in Waco, Texas, none of the hospitals have the specialists or the equipment to service you. Now, Waco is a pretty affluent place, right? And we have 2 major healthcare facilities. But if you're born prior to 32 weeks, you have to go to Temple. I know that because we did it. Neither Providence nor Hillcrest could take my daughter born at 30 weeks. But McLean Children's could, because they have the specialists and the equipment to keep her alive. She is viable in Temple and not in Waco. How far apart are Temple and Waco?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on how fast you drive. Okay, Louisa likes the speed.
Actually, I said 50.
I think said 50. I was like, I think said 15. It's only 20, 25 miles. It's not that far, depending on traffic, right? If you're in an ambulance, you can get there real quick, believe me. I drove real fast, and the ambulance beat me there. So, all that to say, 20 miles, roughly, dictated the viability of my child. Because this is incredibly dependent on location, financial well-being, okay? These are important factors if your standard is viability, because it's not uniform. Your proximity to a hospital, if your spouse or yourself goes into labor, has a major impact on whether or not your child is viable. What does that say about this standard?
Subjective.
It's incredibly subjective. Okay? Now let me ask you this. This is where you have to talk about what life is actually worth. So set aside the idea of pregnancy and babies just for a second. Let's talk about individuals. You get bit by a snake. You were 3 hours away from the nearest hospital. Your viability point's pretty low here, right? That's a long way to go. Depending on the venom of the snake, you may not make it. You are less viable than a person who gets bit by a snake 3 blocks from the hospital. But are you less valuable?
No.
The issue with viability is it ignores valuability. Does that make sense? You could take the exact same conclusions of viability and use them with fully grown adult people and go, well, that standard's silly. Now, let's just say this. Let's say that you develop some kind of illness, you may never recover. Do you want them to diagnose you and treat you based on your value or your viability? Value, right? If you want the care, you ought to get the care, right? That's something that we generally accept. As a matter of fact, most people cry out for that we ought to be able to have whatever treatment is necessary, provided that we want it. If you want to be treated, you ought to be treated. A lot of places in the world don't do life that way. A lot of places do not administer health care that way. Because viability is used in some countries in the world. Okay, for example, in Europe, some countries have state-funded healthcare systems, and there is a board of people who look at what's called QALYs, Quality Adjusted Life Years. And they determine what care you're allowed to receive based on how much it'll cost versus how many years of life it'll add. And they may decline coverage if it doesn't add enough value to your life. That's a viability standard applied to adults. That seems wrong, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. You can afford the care, but they're like, nah, it's really just not worth it to keep you alive. Seems nasty, doesn't it? Doesn't that feel a little, does anybody else feel icky about that? I feel icky about that, okay? That's gross. So that's one difference that you need to be aware of, okay? Viability, incredibly subjective and incredibly flexible. And you feel icky when you apply it to adults, but a lot of people don't want to feel icky when they apply it to a child. Okay? This is one area where I would throw in some scripture just to be thinking about, okay? Matthew 19:14, Luke 18:16, both places where Jesus says to not prevent the children from coming to him because of such is the kingdom of God, or to such is the kingdom of God, right? The people are bringing their kids to him so that he can bless them. The disciples are holding them away, saying, leave him alone. And Jesus is like, no, you let the kids come to me because the kingdom of God belongs to these kids, right? Or the kingdom of God is composed of such as these kids. Okay, he's placing value on those children where his disciples did not. It says something about the way God puts value on people differently than the way we put value on people. James reiterates that in James chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, when he says, when a wealthy person comes to your assembly and you give them a place of honor, and then a poor person comes to your assembly and you give them a place of dishonor, you are doing wrong. Placing value on people based on the way you perceive them is wrong. It is condemned in the New Testament. So the idea that a religious person can look at the viability point, which is really a valuability point, is nonsense because God values all people, all souls equally. Does that make sense? Okay, that seems pretty simple, right? Let's back up one more square. All right, brain activity. Lane, this is where we try to kill you. Brain activity. First, electric patterns that we would say are similar to brain activity occur at 24 to 27 weeks. We related that to someone being brain dead, for example. So here's my question. The brain activity that occurs at 24 to 27 weeks, the argument against it is not normal brain patterns. Or it is not fully developed. Okay? It's just electrical waves. Does anybody know at what point your brain is fully developed?
It's like 29.
After birth.
Mid to late 20s.
25 for males, 18, 20.
Okay? Mid to late 20s. All right? If we're wanting a fully formed brain, everybody in this room is going to be a lot worried right now. All right? Except me. Me and Susan, fully developed brains. Okay? But the rest of you guys, still in the developmental phase, which is part of the reason that we wait a while to let you drive a car or buy alcohol or cigarettes or a lot of other things. We identify that pattern that your brain's not really fully developed and we let your parents make a lot of decisions for you, right? Does everybody see that? That's a legal thing, but The other thing is the reality that your brain just is not fully developed until later in life. Well, neither is this. We're just telling you the point at which, hey, that thing has brain activity. That thing at the very least has the base brain functions to do the things that you do automatically and never think about. Breathe, blink. Your circular system runs. Your reflexes run. Something that was really, really interesting, and you'll see it both in utero and out, is that infants have the ability to feel pain, which is usually a thing that's brought up. But one of the interesting things there is they can react to stimuli such as when Mila was first born and she was about yay big, okay, she could react to things that she did not like. When something happened that scared her or that was cold or whatever else, we had this thing that they called stop hands, which is she does this, okay? If I took this pen and threw it at you, you would do largely the same thing, okay? It's the earliest pattern that you develop as a child. Where if I toss this at Megan, hands come up, face turns. Now Megan makes eye contact because she's an athlete, so she watches the thing and catches it, right? But if something flies out of the dark at you, it's Halloween time. Go to a haunted house. Every time something jumps out of the dark, you're going to go like this. That's exactly what an infant does. Exactly. It's base instinct. And the groundwork for that's laid at 24 to 27 weeks. And you really don't grow out of that particular pattern. Now, sure, you knew I was throwing a marker. You don't really think I'm trying to kill you with it, so you watch it and catch it, right? But if it was a knife, you probably kind of hands up, get away, dodge, move, right? I watched my daughter, who was born at 30 weeks, do that on day one. Stop hands. Okay? She was in a little incubator thing, and when they opened the door, immediately, stop hands. It's cold. Okay? Gave her her first bath, stop hands the whole time. Cold, wet, don't like it, hate every bit of it. And then eventually they cry, which is what you would do if it gets bad enough. Okay? That level of brain activity is present 3 to 6 weeks before my daughter was born, but obvious at 30 weeks because I got to watch it happen. Okay? Brain activity. And again, the biggest thing here, mid to late 20s for you, Lane, I'm sorry, that's when your brain will fully develop. Explains a lot of things. But if we're waiting for fully developed brain to get you to be right where your dad is, for example, and Susan may argue that your dad's not fully developed there either, like he makes a few impulse decisions as well, but your brain's not fully developed. But nobody's arguing that because your brain's not fully developed, it would be okay to kill you. Okay? Here's the other thing, okay? If brain activity is what we're going to go with, what about somebody in a coma? How long does a coma usually last?
A couple months?
A few years at most. Okay. Now the longest coma ever was 42 years. That's a long time. Okay. But would it be wrong if someone is put into a medically induced coma, which is basically shutting their brain down except for base level functions, if I stabbed him in the heart? I like everybody smiled like, ha ha ha, stabbed in the heart. You guys are really morbid. But would it be wrong?
Yes.
Why?
Because brain activity doesn't dictate life.
Because brain activity doesn't dictate life, right? The fact that their brain's asleep, the thing is that it's the same context we use in my line of work when we're talking about a person who is not having their full brain function. Like they're in skilled care, they're not able to feed themselves, dress themselves, bathe themselves, go to the bathroom, those kind of things, what we call activities of daily living. And it's legally defined in my line of work, where we have the provision in law that says there's nothing that says you can't be better tomorrow. So we can't treat you as if you're dead. Your kids can't take away all your stuff. The state can't take away all your stuff. And if they did, and you do get better, they have to give it back. Okay? Interesting clauses that are out there in law, and I work in finance, so this is a finance aspect of it, but I work with it all the time, so I'm very familiar with it. It's important because the state at least recognizes the idea that you could just get better tomorrow. It could happen. Well, what about the case of this child? It has low-level brain activity at 24 to 27 weeks, but what's going to happen if you leave it alone?
It's going to fully develop.
It's going to keep developing. As a matter of fact, it's going to keep developing for the next, 25 to 30 years. And if left alone, it will fully develop. We'll get into the context of time here in just a second. Okay, so that's brain activity. Any questions on those things so far? We've covered half the list. Heartbeat. What's the issue with heartbeat?
Well, CPR is when your heart stops pumping. So why do they try to resurrect them and bring them back alive?
Okay, so barring what's called a do not resuscitate, a DNR, they are supposed to resuscitate you when your heart stops. That's when they get out those little paddles and boom, shock you, or they press your chest and blow in your mouth, right?
But they do
CPR.
say you're dead then.
What's
right?
that?
They do say you're dead.
They could say that you're dead on the
"We're trying to bring
table,
you back
but
to life."
there's a difference between being dead on arrival and a person being... So when you hear it, like if you've ever watched a medical show and they say, all right, I'm going to call it, that's when they call the person's time of death. So, for example, if you did die, they don't date your death back to the first time that they started administering CPR. They date your death or time your death to the time when they stopped.
When they give up on trying to help you.
Correct.
Is your heart stopping?
When they stop trying to resuscitate you. Because that's the point at which you're dead.
Why?
That's how we medically
Well,
define it.
if they're doing
So-
CPR,
They're pumping
you're
your
still
blood in your
getting
body.
breath. It may not be of your own will, but you're still getting it from them. You're still getting air forced. And they are pumping your heart still. It's not you doing it, but they are helping that process happen.
So, another question. Person's in a coma for 1.5 years. Did they date their death back to the day the coma started or the day they take them off life support?
Take them off life support.
Why?
Because that's when the heartbeat stops.
Correct. So again, we're talking brain activity right now. We haven't gone to heartbeat yet. Still on brain
Oh, I thought
activity.
you were at heart.
Had I moved to heartbeat?
Yeah.
But I think it's the same.
Okay, sorry. Let's go to heartbeat. I didn't realize I'd shifted gears, but let's do that. All right. Barring a DNR, you do have to resuscitate a person. When they compress on your chest, they're causing your heart to pump. Okay? So your heart is still beating, you're just not doing it. Okay? Follow-up question. Okay, let's chest compressions. What about this? There's probably a lot of these in the auditorium this morning. Oh, good grief. Oh, this is the right one. Pacemakers. What are those designed to do?
Heartbeat.
Your heart pace.
Well, that's when your heart gets out of rhythm or stops, it shocks it. Why does it do that? Because if it doesn't,
It would stop.
your heart might stop. Or the irregularity of your heartbeat would cause you to pass out. Okay? Now, people with pacemakers, they're being artificially put back in line, right? Or people getting CPR. They are literally being manually pumped. Right? Did we argue whether or not they're alive? Are all the people with pacemakers dead? I mean, they're all going to wander in there, a bunch of zombies in the auditorium this morning if they're not, but you see what I'm saying? They have a machine that causes their heart to continue to beat and stay in rhythm, but nobody argues that because their heart can't beat independently, that they're dead. So here's my question with heartbeat. If a heartbeat is what is necessary to be considered alive, what do we do with pacemakers or people that should receive CPR? Do we just, oh, they're dead, their heart stopped beating, hands off? Or do we do everything we can to keep them alive?
I thought medically it was they're dead, but they're at a point where we can bring them back.
So, again, based on the way that we classify their death, we don't time it back to the beginning of the resuscitatory effort. Right?
Is that a scientific thing, or is that just how
That-
you
that's
medically
just-
define it?
That's how it's medically defined.
That doesn't mean it's right then.
I understand. I don't believe that a heartbeat is
I
right either.
think you could argue that with any of these, Lisa. That doesn't make them right.
I
Yes, the whole
I know.
point is that none of these are right, right?
I get that. I'm playing devil's advocate.
That's fair, I understand.
Because that's how I
But I'm saying, if your definition is heartbeat, I'm going to ask where you get that. Scientific community, I'm going to go, oh, well, here's some examples where the scientific community doesn't support that belief. Okay? I'm only using this as an example because someone will present it as the scientific case for when someone is alive. And I will point to scientific cases where a heartbeat does not define life, which is a person in need of CPR or a person in need of a pacemaker. I'm using the incorrect definition to debunk the incorrect conclusion. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I am agreeing to play the field on their terms and defeat it with its own definition. Does that make sense? I don't agree with any part of that. I'm just using examples that if the heartbeat's the point, Here's the problem with that conclusion, right? All right.
I think that you could make these arguments in the Bible, but they're not gonna come to you to listen to what you have to say about that part. So you have to come to them to make arguments in a world that they agree with.
That makes sense.
There's one more thing that I'll do, and then I'll end the video. And if you guys want to do the statistics part, we can. I don't want to stretch this into 2 weeks because it's probably not enough material to do so. The most important factor that is ignored in this discussion is this. Time. T-I-M-E. Okay? If a heartbeat defines life, and again, keep in mind, I'll give you the scriptural point on this. We exist in time. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The beginning of time. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, we dwell in time. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we dwell in time. There is a time for all things. Time is very, very important to us. However, 2 Peter chapter 2, time is pretty irrelevant to God. Which is why last week we talked about God having an idea of where things will go, and God can consider something to have started when he speaks it into existence, but we can't consider it to have started until it exists in time. Does that make sense? Okay, we're all good so far? So, time is the idea that if I allow time to pass at any stage of this list, what will happen? If I allow time to pass,
It will develop.
it'll develop, and eventually
Your argument will be void.
this argument will be void, okay? If your argument is that a heartbeat is life, leave it alone here and it will get there. If your argument that brain activity is life, leave it alone here and it will get there. If your argument is viability, leave it alone here and it will get there, okay? The question becomes is that when does it cease to be life is when you intervene to prevent time from passing. Now, Lane is not an adult yet, okay? If I kill him, I will have prevented him from becoming an adult, right? In the same way that if you kill a child, you will have prevented it from becoming a toddler, teenager, adolescent, adult. The question here is not when do we get to set the beginning stage, it's when does my intervention prevent the next stage. If we accept, just for the hypothetical case, that it is alive and we leave it alone, time will prove me right every single time, except when by some natural cause it doesn't get born. Which is why I mentioned last week that one of the worst things being done right now is calling miscarriage an abortion, because a miscarriage is showing that with the passage of time, this will not occur. Or a stillborn child, no matter how long you wait, will not become an alive child. There is a difference between knowing something is not alive and saying something is not alive. If I say that these things are not alive, I have to intervene to make my case true. If I say that these things are alive at all of these stages, that this child is alive at every one of these stages, time will prove me right with no intervention at all. Does that make sense? The thing is that in order to prove my point, I simply have to wait. But in order to prove your point, you have to intervene. Does that make sense? Which is why the passage of time is important. The Bible speaks constantly about time. God doesn't call death by natural causes murder. He causes me intervening to end someone's life murder. Why? They're dead either way, right? But if they fall off a cliff, or I stab them, there is a difference. Why? I know, I keep coming back to stab it. If they fall off a cliff or I push them, does that work better for you? What's the difference? One's on purpose, one's not. I took action in someone else's life, in someone else's timeline, to cause it to be cut short. The problem that we have to discuss here is, without the intervention of a third party, what would happen? That's the case for us dwelling in time. We don't treat, even in our modern day laws, in our modern society, we don't treat someone dying as a murder unless a third party intervened. But by comparison, We don't treat the intervention in someone else's life as murder when it's a child. It's the only context that we don't treat it that way. Do you understand? It's us failing to acknowledge the one limitation that we all share, which is we all exist in time. I will eventually die at some point by my action or the passage of time. But it will not be murder unless one of you or someone else does it to me. Until you step and cut off my timeline, it's not murder. It's just the passage of time. I will inevitably die at some point. It's just going to happen. That's how life works. This child will inevitably die at some point. Some children never make it to step 6. They just don't. And it's sad, but it is reality. Some children make it all the way to step 6 and then never go home with their parents. And it's sad, but it is reality. But the overwhelming majority of children, if left alone, make it all the way through step 6, go home with their parents, and grow up. Unless we keep them from doing that. Does that make sense? Sometimes, the fact that, almost as if it's setting God aside just for a minute, and I generally don't set God aside, but let's set him aside just for a minute. It's almost as if even the universe has a say in things, like if you leave that alone, it'll be alive. Setting aside all the spiritual value and everything else, if you just leave that thing alone, it will be fine. We know that biologically. By the way, the only stat that I'll give you today, 96% of biologists agree on this point, that life begins here. 96%. That's really high. Guys, that's an overwhelming majority. It almost seems as if they're cheating on that study. Okay? That's within the last 4 years. They did a self-reported evaluation of biologists, many of them pro-choice, some pro-life. I think it was like 2/3 pro-choice biologists. They all agreed that it was here. They just said it doesn't matter. They don't care when life occurs. They just believe you have a right to kill it if you want to. But this is the only consistent point. All right. Any questions before I stop the video? Awesome. Thank y'all for listening.